Hello, and welcome to Pehchaan, where we unpack the stories and identities of extraordinary Pakistani Americans. I'm so excited to introduce you all to a good friend of mine, Noorain Khan, who is here with us today to tell us a little bit about her journey. Nuran and I became friends over a decade ago on the streets of Karachi. It's true, we actually met at the Karachi airport when both of us were working there for various NGOs. We'll tell you all about that. But today, Noorain is actually the national board president of the Girl Scouts of America, which I think is so tremendous for a Pakistani American to have achieved that role. I can't wait to talk to her about that. Before we get to it, I have to tell you about all her other accolades. Noorain is also the director and senior advisor to the president at the Ford Foundation, and she is a former Rhodes Scholar. I don't know if it's like you're once a Rhodes Scholar, always a Rhodes Scholar. You can tell us about that, Noorain. And then has worked also at Goldman Sachs, at the White House, and many other places. So we are extremely lucky to have Noorain be part of the Pakistani community and to have her here with us today to just talk about both her journey as accomplishing all those things, becoming the first kind of Muslim American to hold that position at the Girl Scouts, but also the many layers of her identity. So Noorain, thank you so much for being here today.
Breen, thank you so much. And Breen and Bilal, thank you so much for having me. I'm totally blushing. I really appreciate that very gracious introduction.
Oh, thank you. Well, I am only speaking from the heart. So, Noorain, I guess a good place to start, since we are talking today about the incredible role that you have at the Girl Scouts of America, is to talk about your experience growing up in Michigan, I believe, right? And how Girl Scouts played a role in that, but just in general, what it was like to be a young Pakistani girl growing up where you did.
Great. Well, I was born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My parents had lived there for many years, and my dad actually moved to the U.S. in 1967. But my siblings and I were all born and raised in Grand Rapids. I became a Girl Scout in second grade. My mom was a Girl Guide in Pakistan, actually. And so I think that's what made her familiar with at least scouting, the concept of scouting. And actually, I meet a lot of South Asians, a lot of even my in-laws. People were involved in the Scouts, whether Boy Scouting or Girl Scouting, or Girl Guiding as it's known abroad. And there's lots of touch points. So that's always a point of reference. And it's surprisingly a common experience or not uncommon for parents of different generations.
That's so interesting. What's a Girl Guide? I don't even know.
A Girl Scout is just the British term. So Girl Guides are the UK, and obviously, the colonial legacy means that South Asians were accustomed to the British originated concept.
Oh wow, that's so cool. So your mom had done that, so she already knew about Scouts in a way.
In a way, there's a familiarity, and I think obviously the notion of being single gender really resonated for my parents, and they, knew it was a safe space. It was very family oriented, and they, that sort of stuff was exciting to them. And certainly at that time in the early 1990s, through today, we were, the concept of the outdoors and, being self-sufficient, that's all important, but it really had transitioned to a girl leadership organization. And so much of this was about, pushing your daughter, pushing yourself, offering opportunities that she wouldn't have in the classroom. And I think that's really what resonated for them, or at least partially what resonated for them. They were, of course, the camping and whatever else was fine, crafts, cookies, whatever else. But I think they were like, oh, this is an opportunity to grow and develop and things that we can't teach Noorain at home. So
that's so cool. I think for me, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts just represented Americana at large. And I felt so different from how I was being raised by my Pakistani parents. I think you didn't have that kind of cultural disconnect with it because your parents didn't even see it that way. Your mom had already done it. But tell me a little bit about that, because I feel like now I have friends who have their kids in Boy Scout troops that, for example, are run by their masjid. Yeah. So it's all the troop members are Muslim. And so it's so different from how I kind of imagine it. And my kids are both in Scouts, but their troops are largely white just because of the area that we live in. Yeah. What was it like for you? Was it pretty diverse?
Yeah. Well, what's so interesting is at least Girl Scouting, which is different than Boy Scouting, is federated. So it's really localized. It kind of takes on the character of a lot of the volunteer leadership locally. So you could find a place that, where that, the diversity is really important to leadership. It's at least a value of the organization. But It takes on the character of wherever you are. For me, my own troops came from my school system, which was actually largely white. So my day-to-day experience in early Girl Scouting was not particularly diverse in terms of like racial demographic. But people came from different economic backgrounds and other different lived experiences. As I grew older, and especially as I entered middle school and high school, I started doing programming that wasn't just limited to my troop, but was offered through my council, which is the kind of, the more local representation of the national organization. And that's where I really kind of blew my mind. I was doing a lot of programming, and not just like you come in on a Saturday and like that's an experience you have where you interact with something different, but sustained programming over many years with people who are very, very different than me in terms of demographics, lived experiences, economic opportunities, what your parents did professionally. And all these kids were from my hometown, but I didn't go to school with them. And it was a very inclusive place where people didn't remove that to enter and show up. They embraced it. It was encouraged. And I always say, we have diversity, equity, inclusion trainings in the workplace today. That's such a common thing. My first experience thinking about equity was in Girl Scouting, where not only were we brought together for this incredible program, but we had to learn how to be together, and they were very intentional about that. So Girl Scouts was a very inclusive place for me and taught me about that. And, I was a hijab-wearing person with immigrant parents. I felt very confident. I wasn't ever sensitive about that, but it was the first place where, like, in my school context, I was like that person. In the Girl Scout context where I was talking to people different, like my difference was like the least difference. There was so much else going on in terms of race, class, queerness, whatever else. Like there was a lot of other stuff happening, and that just, it trained me. It helped me embrace that in like later parts of life. As you go to college, you start meeting people who are different than you, and that wasn't my first time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Noorain, I want to this is fascinating. So I want to unpack this with another sort of dimension, which is, you were there at Girl Scouts so early that it must have had a very formative impact on your identity. And I kind of want to, ask, do you feel like you identified more as a Girl Scout than perhaps you did as a Pakistani American? And did they ever compete in any way? Did they complement in any way? You talked a little bit about your Muslim American identity as well, but talk to me about how your identity was shaped at that point as a Girl Scout.
I never saw them in conflict. I mean, to me, I have so many layering identities. Not only am I Pakistani American, I'm Pehchaan and Punjabi. That means my parents speak different first languages. Not only am I, American, I'm a Muslim American. I'm practicing, I'm believing. That's really important to me. Not only that, I'm Shia. Both my parents were raised Shia, so that's like very core to who I am. So to me, I never found that any of these things were in conflict with one another. I felt like I am these things, and I bring any of those things with me into the other spaces. But no one was asking me to leave any of it behind or have it not show up. And certainly for some of it, because I wore hijab for so many years, it's not like you could actually leave it behind. You were identified, based on what you looked like, at least for me growing up through high school. So I just, and it's so funny because Amreen, you alluded to the notion of Americana, and like, you're totally right. My dad always had the mindset that, we were very, very proud of our background. We traveled to Pakistan a lot. My grandparents came to visit. They, it wasn't like I never felt ashamed. I don't know what sort of Teflon my parents raised me with, but they were just like, oh, you're just like cooler than everyone else. You have so much more going on. And I so absorbed that. I never, I want to respect that other people have different experiences, and you may have felt more of a conflict, or you didn't feel represented, or, like I read, there's so many more storybooks for my kids, for example, and they're all about like, doing Eid at school or whatever else. And my mindset was, why don't you know about my thing? My thing is so amazing. I can't wait to tell you. And it's definitely like one coping mechanism. We really have to unpack where that came from. But I felt such pride and enthusiasm and Like, I truly couldn't wait to share all of my practicing traditions with other people. And I feel
that really resonates for me because my parents were the same way. They had so much pride in who they were. Like, they didn't feel like they were second to anything.
Yep.
And I feel like that really helped me a lot too, because I had a lot of confidence growing up that I came from something that meant something.
Yeah.
But I do think that there were a lot of times growing up where it was eroded maybe by the way that I was treated by others or perceived by others, or the way that I saw my parents be perceived for having accents, for example. So does that piece of it resonate for you? Do you feel like there were times where other people didn't perceive your identity as positively as you did, especially somebody who wore hijab? Like, I don't know if that ever created problems.
I can literally count on my fingers like the number of incidents that I felt like really were challenging to me. Certainly in the immediate wake of 9/11, like, I was super nervous to be in public space. I was in a place that I didn't feel safe, like, day to day. I was nervous about yelling at me, go home, like, in a place where no one had ever said anything like that to me. So I would say there were a handful of instances, most of which were in the wake of 9/11, where I felt that sensitivity. But I don't know, like, I know people thought things and maybe even said things, but like something about like maybe it was my mindset made me feel like I'm sure there were things. I just felt a lot of pride and confidence, but for no good reason. So I'm sure. And
I love that. I think that's great. I think that's nice to hear sometimes. And, my brother said this thing to me that always stays with me. He's like, actually, growing up in the 80s and 90s in America, it was actually a pretty nice time in America. Like, and I think about that now. I'm like, like, all of our neighbors were really nice to us.
Yeah.
They might not have known a lot about Pakistan, but they were really open to us. And I didn't feel like it was, sometimes, we just think like difference means a lack of like community or lack of understanding. And that doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah. And you have to think, like, for example, for neighbors, like, their input, like, what was coming to them was an interaction with you or your family, right? And like, that was probably like largely positive or cool. And now people have so many more and different inputs, not all of which are healthy. And so they're navigating and reconciling those. And so when you point to that age, there's a lot of specificity about what the overall vibe was like, how this country was doing economically, like, just mindset, where you were living. It's probably quite specific to that. So I'm not claiming that, like, I definitely think I had a unique experience. And, my answer to all of that is not like, buck up and be proud and everything will be great. That's not true. It's not healthy. It's not right. And it's actually probably not particularly relevant right now, given the context in which we're operating. But it is like how my parents were. And like, my mom's an amazing cook, like, amazing cook. My parents had people over multiple nights a week. Like, I think that was like early food diplomacy. Like, they were just conquering our city through dinner parties, whether or not, most of our dinner guests were not Pakistani or South Asian or anything like that. And so that is actually a value of mine that's really important to me. And it's not lost on me that there's something about food and shared culture that's an opportunity for connection. But we are living in different times for sure.
Absolutely. So speaking of connection, I know we're going to get to the part where, you and Noorain were together in Karachi and what that was like. But I want to talk a little bit about what happened before that in terms of your connection with Pakistan that actually led you to go to Pakistan. So talk to me about what your connection with Pakistan was like as a child. Like, did you guys go back once a year, every couple of years to see family? And at what point and how did you sort of come up with a plan to go to Pakistan and spend a year there and sort of contribute there? So talk to us about the pre-journey before Noorain came into your life and everything changed.
Oh my gosh. And there's before Noorain and there's after Noorain. And it got so much better after. So,
by the way, Nuran's mom's name is Noorain.
It's true. It's totally true.
So we are like bonded in a very special way.
I think our dads are my mother and your father are from the same, like, literally the same village too.
I think that might be true. Yeah.
Okay, so
Maybe that explains the shared pride. They both kind of like come from this prideful culture.
totally. So let's see. We grew up going to Pakistan at least probably every year or every other year. At the same time, my parents were big hosts, and so we had people coming, so relatives coming and staying with us, and that meant sometimes relatives coming and staying us for like up to a year, like cousins staying at our house, going to school with me, riding the school bus, whatever else. And at that time, it's not like we had like a huge house, like we were all just like living together. And then that meant also grandparents. My father's parents would come and stay like the whole summer. And then it also meant like people who were like from Pakistan who were getting operations and other things at my dad's hospital would come stay with us for like 2-3 months too. So like this is just imagine just like this like clearinghouse of people constantly. No one's telling you how long they're staying. All the meals are being served. So that's the input in the house. Then when people would come, especially my Pehchaan family would come, and especially in the summer, we would grill a lot and we would do like full dastarkhan, only eat on the floor. That's the only way you could like feed like 20 people.
Fit all those people, yeah.
Totally, yeah. And so that was so awesome and special and a huge part of my lifestyle. And then the visits were to Lahore to see my mom's side of the family. And then not just to Peshawar to see my dad's side of the family, including my grandparents, but to Pehchaan, the village, it's not a village. There's actually a village outside of Pehchaan where my dad's family is from. And so that would be at least a couple of weeks, usually in the summer, where it was like a lot cooler. And then family weddings, whatever else. But you can imagine that like Pakistan loomed very large in our minds. And I'd say most of our meals were Pakistani food at home. Like whenever we cooked food at home, that was like the default. And so I felt a huge connection, a huge affinity. I never felt, I don't feel like nationalistic about Pakistan. I feel like it's the sum of so many amazing cultures and so many amazing people in my life. And I think I felt over the course of time that at that time, and this is before like war on terror discourse and before 9/11, like most people just like didn't know what it was. Like it was like if they knew anything, it was India, and they barely knew that in my hometown. And so I felt like a lot like I had to educate people, or that was like part of what I was doing. And it also was just interesting being from a like bilingual, bicultural within Pakistan family, because I didn't know that was weird. I just, like my parents have different first languages. It just didn't occur to me that was unique. And then later on in life, people are, I guess it felt like a novelty to people later on. But my family, we were Urdu speaking around the house. But then whenever relatives came, they spoke Pashto. And
so Nuran, about your parents, I'm kind of curious, like, did they have an arranged marriage? Because it's not that common, I guess, for people to get married across cultures in Pakistan, is it?
Yeah, they had an arranged marriage. My dad was already living here. And there was like a common family member, and as I mentioned, like we're Shia, so like there was some sort of like dad's sister, mom's sister knew each other, and that's how that happened.
And that's so interesting that both being Pathan and being Shia are kind of minority cultures within Pakistani culture. So what you were seeing as like mainstream Pakistan culture in your house was maybe different than like your typical Pakistani Sunni household. And I'm curious about that. Like, was there a point where you realized that your like idea of what Pakistan was maybe different than other people's idea, or did that not really come up? Well, maybe it was during Impact when we went to Karachi.
Right? Well, so I did so I guess I noticed it was a novelty when I described it to other people later. But I also did have the benefit of, my Pashto was like terrible. And actually, my grandmother only spoke Pashto, so like that was like very broken and challenging, but really sweet. Sorry, the language barrier was a challenge. She's awesome. She was awesome. But yeah, I figured that out later. But I also could speak Urdu, quite well back in the day, and like could, I was just like familiar. So it felt like another side of me. If I was like totally just raised only speaking Pashto, I might have felt more alienated or not connected. But I think the linguistic commonality is really important, clothing wise, like food, everything else. Like I felt like very connected to the Lahore side of the family, and I'm very close to those cousins too. So yeah, I figured that out later. I mean, one thing that always made me really uncomfortable about that was like commentary on skin color and the kind of fetishization and like people speaking of that in fond ways. And I didn't always understand. And then slowly over time, when people started saying, oh, like, commentary about fair skin color, that was like super disturbing. And that's where it like started to come up even with cousins and other people. Like you start hearing things like that and you're like, oh, like that doesn't feel right. But, there was a lot of other stuff that did feel totally fine. But that was another place where it was raised.
Yeah, that's I can feel that so hard. Like, I feel like that's so layered and complicated. And even with my South Asian friends, I feel like colorism is just like, it's kind of the soup, I guess, that we're all swimming in. I don't think that's the right analogy, but like, it's hard to kind of separate from that, and like I have my own kids now, you have kids. Like I've heard so many commentaries about especially my girls and their skin color from people. And it surprises me because I think that, we all know that we're supposed to move past this. Do you experience that or no?
I don't currently. And I think it's probably generationally. And I just stopped tolerating stuff I don't believe in. And I started as I got older and just like accumulating and hoarding social capital and whatever else. Like then I can just say, I don't buy that. Please don't say that in front of my child. I don't feel comfortable. And now I just say stuff like that. And I that comes from a place of real privilege, and I feel authority to be able to do that. But like, I'm sure it exists. It gives me some trepidation about community interactions that are not with people of like my generation or generation slightly above me. Like maybe it definitely is not just generational, but I've already drawn some boundaries. I'm going to keep doing it because that's the only way that's the only way forward. I'm not going to be like, I'm going to not embrace my culture because this exists, but like I'm a part of the culture, which means I can change the culture. I feel like I have that access and power. But it's not easy. Then they start saying like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. Oh, they're just so beautiful, like whatever else. And it's like, that is messed up.
And you said it comes from privilege. I think it also comes from great strength that you've been able to do that. And I think it's also challenging when you see the negative aspects of your culture to still embrace your culture. And on that note, to add another layer to your identity, you're married to someone who's Bangladeshi.
That's right.
And so your kids are not just Pakistani who are, part Pehchaan and part Punjabi, but they're also now part Bangladeshi.
Yeah.
And so there's so many layers to that. And the political history of that is so complex too. So how do you do that? How do you kind of retain a pride and a love for your culture when you see kind of negative aspects of it?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, there's negative aspects of every culture. So I have to remember that, right? Like we have colorism, racism here in the U.S. It's my responsibility as an American to speak out about that as much. Like there's no pure culture that is not laden with histories that are contested or give us discomfort today. We're all the legacy of, we have extended legacies. So I think about that, and it just so resonated the first part of what you said, Umbreen, because I'm like, oh, like I can't wait to travel to Pakistan with my kids, like so psyched to do it. And then in the back of my mind, like what floats is like, it has occurred to me, like who's going to talk about their skin color and whatever else. Even if they think they're being nice and complimenting my kids, that's a problem to me. And then I think about servants and like culture around house help. I have a real discomfort with that. Like literally, that is one of the reasons that makes me nervous about traveling there with kids. And especially when they see kids working. And like that's a reality, but like in a home, like that's all like floating around in my mind. So like that's not, but we have labor issues just because like I buy my like Zara clothes. Like we can't all of this exists everywhere. So I have to remind myself that it's not just limited to that context, but I have to, enter it with awareness. But you're absolutely right. Like there's so many layers to my identity, and I don't think it's a zero-sum game. My job is not to make like Pakistani kids that are like whatever the background, like my kids are not like vessels for carrying the culture forward. Like they can choose. I want to show them the very best parts of where my originating story, but they're not pure receivers. They get to apply the values they have, their mindsets, and we all know the notion of cultural preservation on the periphery. Like a lot of the mindsets of people who moved to the U.S. are frozen in the year that they left, right? So like if you've got 80s parents, or my dad's like a 1967 mover, like their notions are from a different time. So like what's really important for me in talking to my kids is them understanding they're part of a global discourse and a diasporic discourse that is very active, that's flourishing, that's bringing new ideas to the table. And like, I mean, I love like following some of the Instagram accounts that I do. Like it feels, you don't feel passive. And so I hope they feel that way too. But it's also just like important to understand the histories and not just take what's been told to you. Oral tradition is so powerful. Love it. Yeah. Like I'm here because of that, right? Like we're talking and sharing these stories. But there is, like I hope my kids study history and context in a way that informs how they interact with their cultures too.
So, Noorain, what you said is so powerful, and it was actually one of the reasons why when we were starting the podcast, it was when I had my first child, when I had my daughter, I was like, all these theoretical conversations about identity suddenly became real, and they were choices that I had to make. So let me ask you, as you think about the global diasporic sort of discourse and you think about kids, but then you translate them into something simple like what language do you want them to pass on or talk about? So talk to me a little bit about, do you speak, do you want them to learn Urdu or Bengali or how does that work?
Yeah. Well, I hope I can learn how it works. I have some thoughts on that, but it's actually quite complicated for me. I feel less of a tension between Pashto and Urdu in my home household. Like Urdu won out, like we can all kind of understand Pashto, but like not exactly. The history, like the independence movement in Bangladesh was very much rooted in oppression around language. People were forced to learn, Bangladeshis were forced to learn Urdu. It was weaponized. There was suppression of Bangla. So I feel responsibility for my kids to appreciate and understand Bangla. I can't speak any Bangla well at all, but I do. That's part of their heritage. Like they're half, Bangladeshi, and so understanding that like colonial, like intra South Asian colonial legacy of Urdu is important, but I enjoy Urdu. I love speaking and I learned to read it. It has deepened my connection with culture, with South Asian culture. So I hope to give them access to that. But I guess my mindset around it is understand the history of what you're a part of and how the many ways in which oppression is manifested. So like I can't say that now to my like 3-year-old, but I am mindful, and I really would, I don't know if grandparents just like want the connection with the grandkids. Like I really wish both sets of grandparents worked harder at speaking their first languages with my kids. But with time, it's going to be very important for them to know where this came from and why. So my reaction isn't like, Urdu is bad. My reaction is understand when you're learning Urdu and when you're learning Bangla and who you're speaking to, how they may feel about it, how they may feel differently about it, and ways in which it enriches people's lives and ways in which it's challenged people who may not be you or your immediate family members. So that's how I think about it. I think that will evolve over time. And I'm definitely speaking in lofty ways about kids who basically only speak English right now. I have a lot of aspiration. Language is so important.
Yeah.
And like I've been thinking about core words for them, kid, love, whatever else we can say. And then of course, like I try to make some of those words Pashto too, because I want them to have some of that reference point. So I don't know. It's hard.
I remember.
It is hard.
I remember when my daughter, for her first day of daycare, We got a call back and they're like, what is pani? She keeps asking
Pani.
for
Pani is,
I'm like,
oh
"It's
my gosh,
water."
I
And
love it.
it's so interesting how they take those languages. I want to ask one more question. And
Wait, can I interrupt you, Bilal, and just say, my toddler's whole classroom says Pani, or said Pani for like a big part of last year.
That's so cute.
in fact, we went for her like 2 year, like, how is she doing? And then her teacher's like, she's come a long way from Pani. So, Pani is like a reference point
I
to,
know, but you like never want them to forget that either, right, Bilal? It's like, it could mean two things. It's like, oh, they've come a long way, and then like, what are they losing as they evolve too? So it feels heavy sometimes.
yeah. So I want to ask you one more layer now, moving to your relationship with your husband, with your partner. So did the weight of history in a different national identity weigh on your courtship? And as you get together, and did you think about, when we have kids and if they ask us, like, what was that like a little bit, like, as those identities fused together?
Well, I so appreciate that question because it did. And what I had the benefit of having taken some South Asian history in college with a professor who, Elora Shahabuddin, she's absolutely amazing. I think she's at Berkeley now, that talked about the independence movement in Bangladesh. And it absolutely blew my mind. And understanding like the facts, historical accounts, what historians have said, and not just what you have been told by family members or, Pakistani sources, for example, to understand the genocide, the independence movement, what it took from an entire generation to fight for their freedom. And my in-laws are from that revolutionary movement. So I knew, before I ever met Sabeel, my amazing husband, I was aware of that. And it's interesting to talk to our elders, Pakistani elders, about that, because my father, who was in the U.S., like I said, starting in 1967, he knew that whole history. He was familiar, he never was defensive. He was never surprised. He was like, yeah, like this is what was happening. It was awful. It was really complicated. He's a contrarian. I love talking to him. So that was present in my mind. My mom lived in Pakistan. Like they had, like state television. We had family members who were in the Pakistani military. So like the mindsets around that were definitely different. And I felt like I was doing some education. Now, this education predated Sabeel because, again, like I was in college being like, hey, did you ever hear about like, potentially 1 million people who were against whom a genocide was perpetuated, rape. The language around what happened is so, it's shocking. It's shocking to people who are not familiar with it. And then people immediately fall to being defensive, explaining like how India was meddling, quibbling about the numbers. And like, you think about it, and like, those are the tactics in other world events, whether we're experiencing them now or in the past. That's what people say when they're defending behavior like that. So it was troubling for me at the time. So by the time I like met Sabeel, I already knew all that stuff, but it was really interesting to meet someone whose parents were part of that generation who had to leave the country because of such things. So like my father-in-law actually joined the Pakistani Foreign Service, was posted in Iran during independence, and then was like waiting for a Bangladeshi passport in Pehchaan as like his first posting. So like you literally leave the country representing one country and then you return as a part of a completely different country. It's such a powerful story. You think about the relatives, the family members that like literally it's not just people like, people were killed, people were raped, people were displaced, but like a generation of people like lost their education, like they couldn't be in school. Like there's all these things that, I knew the academic stuff. I met him. I learned a little bit more, and it definitely loomed large. So, for example, my parents and my in-laws speak English to each other. I'm sure, and I'm certain there are other Bangladeshi people who speak Urdu, but like, given the generation my in-laws are from, like that's just like not something they, would never ask them to do that. But like that, you got to tell my mom, Mom, Dad, like we don't, like it's. it was just part of a discussion we had about our cultures and how we would be in this relationship. And my parents are amazing. My in-laws are amazing. I have found it's been really enriching. Like, the one travesty is I've not yet been to Bangladesh, which I'm so excited to do. But I found, because we have some shared culture, we have shared food. Like, it's kind of like it's close enough that it's familiar, but it's different enough that it's, to me, exciting and awesome and enriching. And that's how I would speak to the proximity of the cultures.
That's so beautifully put, Noorain. I really appreciate how your perspective on it is. And as you were sharing about your father-in-law, my heart just felt so heavy, because in a way I was thinking about how partition has affected my parents. My dad was 2 when it happened. And, I think that the long shadow of that has affected his entire life. But for your father-in-law, that chaos of that moment of partition continued for a good, extra decade plus. And even in the 70s, they reckoning with like, oh, now we're this country and now we're this country. And like that lack of stability and certainty about your future, I can't even imagine, like, it's just so much more fresh, right?
Absolutely.
And then not acknowledged. I think even today, Pakistanis don't really acknowledge what has happened. I think some reckoning has happened, but I know plenty of people, like, as you mentioned, who have, military ties, who just brush it under the rug and don't take it very seriously. This real pain that only happened, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
It's still, people remember.
Absolutely. And we should all remember. I think I'm not familiar with like how people talk about Bangladesh's independence in Pakistan, but I have noticed more people here talk about it. I like talking about it because so much of my Muslim identity and even Pakistani identity is about like activism, talking about colonialism, the colonial legacy, what the UK did. All of that is, there's a whole group of people for whom like activism is core for who they are, and they just either I like to think that once presented with facts, like, people are open to it, and especially if they can see the parallels between other conversations they're having and what happened there, like something switches. But that's not always like it's still deeply under discussed. But it's interesting to see who gets defensive and weird about it for sure. But I don't mind, because like, you're kind of revealing yourself. Like, I get it. You're like, you can turn on and off based on convenience when you see justice or injustice. And that's a bummer.
Yeah. Wow. And I think for your kids to kind of grow up in the legacy of that, like, what a gift. And in a way, I almost feel like they themselves are like an experiment in the great immigration of South Asians. Like, there's no way that you would have met Sabeel if your parents had stayed in Pakistan, right? Like, you could only really exist in an American South Asian identity. So that's fascinating to me too. And how do you think about that now that, you aren't just a Pakistani household, your household is pan South Asian? Do you think about do you identify as South Asian? Do you ever use that term, or do you feel more kinship with kind of the broader South Asian identity?
I do. I think I was very like in the framework of Pakistan, and not even that, because my dad is from the tribal areas. He's not even from like he's not from Peshawar. So like, it's not like I was ever like Pakistan only, like in terms of my framework for how I describe myself. The ethnic pride of Pathans is so surreal. It's so epic. So I have to acknowledge that. But you're referencing like we could only exist here. I think of that myself as like a very active practicing Shia Muslim. Like, that I could not be, maybe in the 80s or even prior. I think there was much more openness among Pakistanis. Certainly, like in my mom, like the Lahore my mom grew up in meant that like they had a ladies' majlis in the house. Like, their neighbors came. They maybe didn't do matam, but they were there, and they were there in solidarity, certainly for Ashura. Like, that is not the vibe now. And that's really unfortunate. But like, I'm able to be a very to observe my faith safely here in the U.S. Because of protections we have. So like, that's very front of mind for me. And like that, that's definitely real. I would say, I'm reading your question was about South Asia. Sorry, can we revisit?
Yeah, South Asian identity in general, and
Yes.
whether you would use that term to describe yourself,
Totally.
family.
Absolutely. I mean, I think like it's just more convenient now. It captures, it's not exclusionary of Bangladeshis, and it more easily actually captures more parts of who I am. And I would just say, like, I have a lot of friends who are a lot of Indian and Sri Lankan friends, a lot of Indian friends. So like it's just, and I feel there's a lot of cultural overlap, definitely in like the like in my faith communities, at least when I'm people are just as likely to be Indian, or just as likely to be, well, mostly Indian and Bangladeshi. So like I just think it's more convenient. I like the Pathans a little bit, like feels like it feels less South Asian, maybe, depending on like it feels more independent of South Asia, I would say.
Yeah, I understand that. It's a different culture in a way than like the subcontinent, the main subcontinent. It's so interesting because the labels that we put on these things are so imperfect, right? None of them capture the reality of like what it means. And the fact that these borders, as we're talking about, were created so recently kind of really emphasizes that it's just all made up, right? None of it is like perfect. And there are ways in which you are similar and different than each of those types of people, however you categorize
You're
them.
totally right. Like, and I think of Pathans, and like we're Pashto speaking, we're not Dari speaking. So whenever I meet some kinds of Afghans, I'm like, oh my God, like same everything. And then I meet others and I'm like, oh, like you're like, that does not feel like what I am. So, so like, language is interesting. How people dress is, dress, food, whatever else. Like there's just, everything is a, little conglomeration. It's pretty cool.
It's amazing. Yeah, it is really cool. You can look at it as a strength if you want to, I think.
And I'm
going to take, go ahead, Phil.
I wanted to dramatize this even more and then sort of pivot from there, which is to say, in some crazy way, the experiment that was West Pakistan and East Pakistan didn't work out. But what you see here in your family is an experiment that can only happen in a place like America, where, something like this is possible. And I think that's really interesting to see and sort of learn. And again, no culture is perfect. There are lots of things to get better here as well. But it's an interesting sort of moment to sort of see that. And I want to use that as a pivot to actually talk about your journey with Girl Scouts now, post you becoming a girl into now. Sort of, having a Pakistani American woman sort of leading the national board of the Girl Scouts. When Ambreen first told me, I was like, that can't be true. Like, what? And then what was even more shocking to me was that I didn't know about it. And I was like, why don't we know that there are people in our community who are, in those roles? And so, I'd love to know your journey to how you got there. And also, did all of this, like, it seems like your identity, your Teflon identity, like you've been through a lot, and whether you processed it or not processed it, but it's a part of what's made you strong and enabled you to do the things that you've done. So talk to me a little bit about your journey, getting that as the first, not just Pakistani American, but the first Muslim American and first millennial leader of that organization.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's so funny because one thing I'm so proud of is like, I've never had to shoehorn myself into acting like someone else to be here. And that's really important to me. I think I've been talking to people about this. I was talking to my boss about it recently, and because I very much present as a millennial, like the way I talk, like the speed, like the tone, whatever else. And I just like decided it's non-negotiable. Like I'm not going to have to like put on a different voice and like act older. Like I have what I need. I believe I have what I need to do what I need to do and to lead in the way I want to lead. So I'll return to that in a moment, but I'll say I was a girl member of the Girl Scouts until I was a senior in high school, when I earned our highest award, the Girl Scout Gold Award. It's an incredible leadership development opportunity that culminates in receipt of this like really wonderful award that comes with all sorts of other things. And for me, it also included scholarship money, which was amazing, and it helped me like learn about who I was as a leader. And then for the 10 years after that, a little more than 10 years after that, I was a volunteer. I moved, when I was in college, I volunteered at my local council in Houston, Texas. I moved abroad for 2 years when I went to Oxford, and I was not an active Girl Guide or Girl Scout then. But when I returned to go to law school and early on my career as a lawyer, I called up Girl Scouts of the USA and said, like, I want to be a volunteer. I found really great leadership development opportunities as a volunteer, which was pretty cool because not only was I contributing and serving, but I definitely got something out of it. I built new relationships. I stretched myself in a lot of different ways, substantively and like leadership wise. So I was a volunteer for a long time, and then I was invited to join the national board in 2014. And I think at that point I was, one of the youngest members, and we have a 30-person board. It's a national board, and we're elected at. This is very technical, but I'm just going to tell you guys because it's kind of juicy and it relates to what I'll talk about later, is like how I show up. But we're elected by delegates who come from our 112 councils across the country. And they meet every 3 years, and they, elect a slate of board members. And they also like amend our constitution and do a number of like business matters when they come together. So I was elected in 2014 for a 3-year term. And then, we meet again in 3 years, and, some people return, there's new people. So I served 3-year terms, first year as a member at large, then as secretary, and then last time as second vice chair. And so I had progressive development. Like, I learned a lot about our movement's governance. During this time, contemporaneously, I served on a lot of other nonprofit boards, small and large. And then eventually in 2015-16, I joined the Ford Foundation, where my job is to fund organizations and understand their governance structure. So like, it was a perfect marrying of something that like was so near and dear to my heart, that meant a lot to me personally and contributed to my growth, not only as a girl, but as like a young professional, that had values I'm really aligned with, because not only do we do, our mission is to build girls of courage, confidence, and character who make the world a better place. And that, I find that so moving. It's not who make this country a better place. Like, we're really thinking about the world. And the scale is mind-boggling. I mean, we have 50 million alumni. Almost 1 in 3 living American women were Girl Scout alums. We've got, every woman Secretary of State, almost every single woman astronaut, 70% of women senators. Like, there's something about the program here. It could be what you learn substantively. It could also just be that you have a caring adult in your life who invests in you, who's not a parent, who's not a teacher, a third person who invests in you. So, and then, you're in a troop, and we talked about this earlier, Umbreen, but like, not all troops are school-based. A lot of them are faith community-based, or just kind of a bigger community. So you're just like getting things done with people who are different. And so all of that, is incredibly powerful to me. And then it married with my day job, because a lot of my early volunteer opportunity is kind of related to being a lawyer, and then ultimately as a board member. So like, I cannot believe, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to have this scale and the impact I care about. And I'm so grateful that I don't have to compromise both on who I am and the nature of the organization, which has a mission that I feel really aligned with. And I'll say our founder, Juliette Gordon-Low, who was actually our first national president, she had really interesting history as a woman who was, single later in life, who was a disabled woman. She was actually almost fully deaf, or deaf, certainly hard of hearing. There was a lot of there were a lot of intersections to her identity too. So she, wasn't a Pakistani woman, but she was definitely a woman with different lived experiences. So there's a lot about her story that prompted her to found the organization. I want to go back to the delegate body that elected me, because it's really representative from around the country. And I'm not the first leader of color. Like, we elected a Black woman leader in the 70s. We've had a Japanese American leader and an Indigenous Native American leader. We've had, multiple Black leaders, actually. So the delegate body has elected, a diversity of leadership. I'm so proud of that. So I feel like there's some responsibility about being a first that feels so daunting. but I feel like I stand on the shoulders of a lot of other people who were there first, and they had flourishing tenure as leaders of our organization. So it's not, I hope, and I certainly hope and pray that I'm not going to be an anomaly. There's going to be a lot of other firsts after me, including white leaders. Like, I think, we're a really diverse organization, and that's a priority for us. At our annual meeting this July, we passed a resolution amending our constitution, saying we're an anti-racist organization. And part of my mandate is working with our national CEO to implement that. So it's pretty cool. And so they know exactly what they're getting. This was like no surprise. I didn't cut my hair short and start talking slower in a lower voice, trying to feel like a gravitas. Like, I felt like who I am was enough here, and I'm so grateful for that.
That is so cool. It really speaks to the culture of the organization, I think, and you did a good job of outlining the history of it, and how that's always been a part of it.
Yeah.
In a lot of DEI conversations, we talk about how important representation is, especially representation at the top.
Yeah.
And unlike Girl Scouts, a lot of the corporate boards in this country are still white and male, and there's very little representation, and we have such a long ways to go.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear from you, just sort of, what does it mean that you're at the head of the organization? Is there any way that the fact that you are Muslim, Shia, Pakistani, married to Bangladeshi, all the pieces of your identity, does it matter that you're in that position? Does any of that, do you have any, does any part of that come out, or do you have any influence as a result of those identities? Or could you just be anybody from any background, and would you be doing it the same way?
Yeah. And I would add, like, I'm a Michigander. I'm not from, like, I'm not a coastal elite. Like, I don't think of myself as that. So, like, I've got lots of layers of my identity. I think a couple things. One, I can definitely more readily put myself in the shoes of people who come from non-traditional backgrounds, not just my backgrounds, but other backgrounds. I'm just, like, more open-minded about what it feels not to be seen or represented or have that background. So I think that's an asset to this particular job. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is, like, our delegate voice, our democratic process in our governance model. And my focus is not just the loudest voices, but, like, how do we make sure everyone feels included? All of that stems from all of the parts of who I am. So I don't think I think, like, me in this role, I'm more effective and able to achieve my goals because of that. I'd also add, like, I feel like my first troop visit was with a Muslim troop in Northern Virginia. I baked Taylor Swift themed cookies with a bunch of high school girls, all of whom were going for their gold award. And that was important to me. I think I don't shy away from that. I can't wait to visit with all different troops, including many more Muslim troops. And it feels really special to me that, they and their parents and their community members felt like this was an important way for them to grow and flourish and contribute. So it's definitely not interchangeable. It's important in me carrying out my mandate, not just in terms of the DEI work I'm going to do, but just in terms of, delegate voice, representation, governing our movement in a healthy way, having diverse staff, having membership that reflects our communities, and not, we're not there yet. We don't have the membership that I think that we're capable of having.
Yeah.
And not just,
I love that this is, like, no big deal in Girl Scouts.
Yeah.
Diversity seems so imbued in the organization. But, just stepping back a little bit, I think so many times as a Muslim American, I feel like I'm in the minority. I really feel that feeling. And I think, to Bilal's point, that he didn't know that the, board president was a Muslim or a Pakistani. Like, I do think it's also both no big deal and also, like, such a big deal, because it's sort of, it runs counter to this messaging that I think Muslims often feel, which is like, we are not imbued in the fabric of the American culture. And it's not true. It can certainly feel that way, but, like, there's so much history. I mean, Thomas Jefferson had a Quran. Like, there's so much history of Islam in America. And I think, it's just kind of something to celebrate that you're in this position. But, Noorain, I want to switch gears, if it's okay, and ask you if I can take you back to 2005, because as I mentioned, Noorain, you and I met in Pakistan, and we're similar ages. We were both kind of in this post-college, or maybe I can't remember now if you were in college or not, but in this point where we were trying to figure out what we're going to do with our lives and our careers, and this opportunity comes along to spend the summer in Pakistan volunteering with an NGO. And if I'm remembering right, the organization you were with was called Shirkat Ka, right? And was it a women's organization?
It was, yeah.
So if you could go back to that in your head a little bit and think about it, like, why did you decide to spend your summer in Pakistan? Were you just looking for opportunities like that in general, or was it going to Pakistan that meant something to you? And what did you kind of get out of that time that you got to spend there?
Yeah, it was definitely going to Pakistan. It wasn't, I felt, like I said, I don't personally, I feel Pakistani, like, connection, but I am not a Pakistani, like, I'm not from Pakistan, like, born and raised in Pakistan. But I feel such connection, such affinity. There was such a hunger. I felt such a hunger to better understand this country that, like, raised my parents. And I wanted to improve language. I wanted to understand cultural stuff. Had been very involved. I was a women's studies major, and a lot of my work was on, like, transnational women's movement. So, like, that was the prompting. It was the nexus of culture and, academic exploration. So I knew I was going to probably work in women's rights or, something in the NGO sector anyways. And then I think we had, that was like a time where there was a lot of public discourse around the hudud ordinances and, like, the women's legal rights in Pakistan. So, like, there had been some, I can't remember what the name of the woman. I mean, there was a very
right, yeah.
popular, really written about. What was her name? I'm not going to remember her name.
Was it Mukhtar Mai?
It was Mukhtar and Mai. Yes, yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, that's it has been a long time since I thought about her or others. So that's what prompted this, and I'm so glad I did it. I am so grateful for that summer in so many ways. And Brain, I was actually going into my senior year of college, and one of the things I'll never forget and will always be grateful for was that I got to experience Pakistan not through relatives. Like, we were independent and in a city where I didn't have family, and Karachi is such a special place. It's so big. It's so diverse. Being a young person, I did feel personally really safe. Like, I feel like I got to explore and experience things. It was such a wonderful, wonderful, like, maybe I contributed. I'm sure I was, like, more dead weight than that is a contributor. Like, I like to think, like, maybe I volunteered and helped, but it really gave me so much more and made me much more aware of the power disparities, and me as, like, a American-raised Pakistani person being like, I want to help. Like, there's pernicious aspects of that mindset that I explored while I was there, and it was definitely because it was Pakistan, and it was extra special because I didn't experience it through the eyes of someone else. There was a little bit of autonomy and ownership over being there, and it had a huge role in what happened to me afterwards, for sure.
Yeah, and let's talk about that a little bit. I do want to say how much that resonates for me too, because I felt like I got to have my own relationship with Pakistan through that program. Like, up until then, Pakistan belonged to my parents and to my relatives, but then I got to kind of have it on my own terms and have my own memories with it. And it definitely formed kind of my subsequent years too, when I went back over and over for opportunities there. And I like what you said about just how being in Karachi was like, you're taking me back now, remembering all the fun that we had together. I know, it was such a formative time. So when you walked away from that, I mean, when you were there, were you thinking, like, I might spend more time in Pakistan? Was that on the tables, or was it more like, I'm going to do this thing and then I'm going to go do other stuff? And then how did you kind of, come out of that experience? How did it inform your next step, I guess?
I think I still have a regret to this day that I probably, like, I would have loved to spend at least a year there. I just think, like, 3 months is, like, not enough time, especially to do, like, the language stuff I wanted to do, and just more. Like, I left feeling like I did my job, but I just have always felt this yearning for for more, like to deepen that relationship and exploration, whatever else. And I mean, there's so many things about that particular program that were powerful because we also had organized experiences, cultural and otherwise, cultural and social experiences that were, again, you're not operating through an intermediary of someone who's like trying to control what you see or only introducing you to what's familiar to them. But there's a lot of intentionality about, we went to Mohata Palace, like we went to I don't know the name of what you call it, but it was basically like a plantation. Like
Oh, right. Yeah.
yeah, like someone who owns a lot of land, and there are people who work.
What is that called, Bilal? They're like farms, but
or the farm.
no. We did do the mangrove farm. They're called farmhouses in Pakistan. That's what they call them.
Yeah,
Farmhouse.
yeah. Like that's complicated, right? Like you go, like everyone's really nice, but you're like, how much is everyone being paid? Like, what's the dynamic here? You know, there's a lot of hospitality, but for whom and how? But like that was just amazing.
Oh, and we met that amazing woman at the Orangi pilot project, the one who was shot. Yeah. We met Edie. I mean,
That's right.
oh, it was such a cool experience. Yeah, now that I'm thinking about it. And then we got to go to Hunza. And, you know, I've been thinking about, I want to take my kids back to Pakistan. I'm really feeling like ready for that.
Yeah.
But then I was like thinking about how traveling to Hunza feels so unsafe to me now because I'm like, oh, all those roads are so windy and there's tons of accidents on those roads. And I'm like, this is the problem. Now I'm like a middle-aged mom. And so I'm like consumed with fear and wanting to protect my kids. But we had kind of the benefit of youth. I guess like they were just like, throw caution to the wind. We went to the State Department, like it wasn't the embassy, right? It was a consulate in Karachi. And they were like, what are you guys doing here? This is not a safe city for all you Americans to be in. And we were like, whatever. Like throw caution to the wind.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like, and I actually missed the Hunza trip, which was like, I can't even talk about how disappointed I didn't get a scholarship if I didn't show up at this thing at school. And now I'm like, who cares about that? I could have gone to Hunza with these people. I will say, like, because I'd spent a lot of time in Pehchaan and other parts of the northern areas, like, you know, like I got a little taste of that, but I really regret missing out on.
The other thing about the Hunza trip, this was 2005, is that we stopped in this town near Balakot, and it was basically like a town that was like taken over by the Taliban, and you could feel like when we got there, because Hunza is actually like a super welcoming and the kind of gender kind of like progressive place, right? But in this specific town that we stopped in NWFP, it was like everybody, you could just feel like all the men were looking at us like, who are these people? And we felt so kind of afraid in that moment. So we kind of like experienced a lot of really kind of poignant moments and on that trip. Yeah, I really wish that Impact still existed. I feel like it was such a cool program. And it really came out of the fact that the Peace Corps is not in Pakistan and has not been for decades. And it would be so cool to have a Peace Corps in Pakistan. You know, I don't know if that's ever going to happen.
Ambreen, like people who go to countries through the Peace Corps have such an affinity. They carry with them for the rest of their lives. Why shouldn't Pakistan benefit from that? You really open people's minds, hearts, whatever else. And like a lot of times the people that show up, like it's like missionaries or it's like actual government, like aid workers in this like very formalistic way. But like it's really a tragedy actually that there isn't more openness and opportunity. And I understand the safety issues, but there are so many downstream implications for the lack of engagement that like the notion of security prevents, like it creates more isolation and alienation. They're like, oh, like the security. Okay, then you have 3 generations of people who just never got to go. Yeah, it's really...
Yeah. Where do you sit with that now in your career? Like, you know, I imagine a lot of your work is pretty domestic in nature, but do you feel like you're still kind of working at that problem, or is that still kind of in the back of your mind as something you'd like to do something about?
I think, I mean, we're talking about gender in other contexts. Yes, absolutely. Certainly from a faith perspective, as a Muslim woman, absolutely. I think I probably have like less business as an American going to Pakistan and telling people what to like. That doesn't feel right anymore. But I work at the Ford Foundation, and we have an office in India that works a little bit in broader South Asia, but not in Pakistan. Like that, like I personally feel so disappointed by that, and that wasn't always the case. I think my father-in-law benefited, in Bangladesh from a Ford project, or other relatives have. And I think there's some of that too in Pakistan and other places. So that feels disappointing and sad in my, just generally. I love my Indian colleagues at Ford, but that really saddens me. I don't know what it looks like to continue being engaged. I think it means resources, financial resources. I think it, and not just personal remittances are fine. Obviously, like my family runs an imambara in Lahore just for women. It has really powerful women's programming.
Cool.
I'm sorry.
That's so cool. It's just for women. I'm trying to imagine that.
And it's like an incredibly feminist space. It's like in a residential neighborhood. It's called Ahmed House. It's like really incredible. So like I'm like, I'd like to, financially support more stuff like that. But my role is not to come in and be like, American women are enlightened. And I'm very aware that like I can't pretend like I'm a Pakistani woman. I think that would be, that's not appropriate. So I don't know what it looks like, but I think that at least from a resource point of view, that's important.
Yeah. I do want to quickly say, Amreen, going back to your earlier point about the impact of the program and the time that both of you had in Pakistan, I don't know if you guys can see this inside out, but outside in, had you both not done that, we would not be having this conversation. In the sense that I think, Amreen, the way that you and I connect and sort of doing this podcast together, I think the relationship that you have with Pakistan, and then Noorain, for you, the fact that you're able to be all the things that you are and Pakistani, I think it comes to a large extent with the fact that you were comfortable with who you were and were able to spend that time in Karachi. And, what happened in Karachi didn't stay in Karachi. I think it still is part.
Some things did, but yeah. Yeah. Bilal, that so resonates. And I'll just say, like, I don't think I would have a huge project I worked on outside of my volunteer work was I did a bunch of oral history work on women who wear hijab in Karachi. And then I did that project in Houston, my senior year of college. And then I actually replicated that in London when I was in grad school. Like, I don't think I'd win the Rhodes Scholarship, but for having participated in that. Like, I think there's a lot of stuff for...
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Remembering, like...
I'm going to have to quote that for Bilal, my husband.
Tell him, like, that was... But there's so... And Marie, it wasn't like just like I got to go. There was a lot of stuff by design that really worked. So I just hope, it would be so nice for more things like that to be accessible, not just to Pakistani Americans or, we had, British people too, but like others. I think it's such a place that is not, it requires nuance. It's so specific and interesting in Karachi, especially.
And, I think a lot of times when we are working in spaces where we're trying to create change and impact, we measure our impact by the numbers of lives. Like, those stats that you mentioned with Girl Scouts, 1 in 3 women, 70% of senators, like those are incredible stats, 50 million people, right? What wide scale impact. But when you actually do Girl Scouts, like my daughter is in it, it's a troop of 15 girls. It's a very dedicated troop leader who spends the time to like come up with fun things for them to do, like go to a farm and pet animals and right. It's so like micro in its impact, and it's so impactful because of that. And I think similarly, a program like Impact it's really a one-to-one. It's a human kind of connection. It's a small scale, right? But it has the potential to have the most impact on a person's life because it's so deep. And so it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, just thinking about impact, not in terms of like numbers of lives affected, but just the depth of the impact itself, right?
That's so powerful. Like we have to realize scale is not about breadth. It could be about depth too. You could have a really profound scale, a ripple effect coming out of one person. And I would just point to like my sister Azmat. My sister Azmat also did impact, and she did work in earthquake-stricken areas. So demoralizing. It's not shocking that she subsequently worked on civilian casualties. Right. She experienced, she had a lot of personal interaction with people who experienced trauma and pain, and wasn't at the hands of drone weaponry or the military, but that stays with you. So that so resonates. We have to think about scale in different ways when we crave impact, however our lives are, and the world does not need to be full of people who do only large-scale change. Large-scale change also happens on the interpersonal level. I really, really do believe that.
This conversation is really energizing. I'm going to put a pin on it, but I think that the three of us, we should think about even leveraging the platform of this podcast to create something like that. We talked a lot about kids. All of us have kids.
Yeah.
Thinking about how do we build a connection between them and Pakistan.
Totally.
Even as we think about our kids, to say, how do we create a program that allows that kind of a connection to continue?
Absolutely.
This is something that we can continue to offline. And if anybody is watching, if they're interested in sort of creating something like that or have something like that, we'd love to get in touch and we'd love to help out in whatever way that we can. I think we have around 10 to 12 minutes. So, Amreen, I want to do one more pivot and then anything else that you've got on your mind as well. I want to come to the fact that Noorain is also a trailblazer in the nonprofit space. And I want to get to this frontier in an interesting way, which is, typically Pakistani parents are like, oh, become a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer, which you kind of were. And then
you kind of were. She was a lawyer.
Yeah. I was there doing it, but mentally, I'm not sure.
You were in because I read sort of the Howard business, the Howard sort of case study on your sort of journey. Where your heart's. I like to joke with my dad as well. My dad trained to be a doctor, and then he became an IT person. And I'm like, what the hell? Like when you spend your whole life doing that, and then when it was time to make money, you became an IT person. Anyways, it's a long story. So you went into the nonprofit space. What was that like? Where was that coming from? And also, was it hard within, your Pakistani parents to be like, oh, you had high hopes and dreams and now I'm sort of going to work in a nonprofit space and change the world?
Yeah. So, I worked as a corporate lawyer for a couple of years, my first couple of years out of law school. And then I transitioned. I spent a year at a nonprofit and then I came to Ford, and where I've been for the last 8+ years. And the transition itself felt so natural to me. My first year at the law firm, I did a huge Girl Scout project that required me to fly out to Chicago like once a month. I worked with all these girls on a consistent basis to plan the Girl Scouts 100th anniversary celebration, which was basically like a big UN. We had girls from like 80 countries come to Chicago, and like they did you just think about this, like 10 years ago, they were working actively on climate change, on gender-based violence. Like they were amazing women. And like pretty soon I was like, I cannot be using my personal vacation time. Like this has got to be my day job. So it actually felt quite natural. And I think everyone who I told about it, they were like, yeah, that sounds right. So there was nothing challenging about that transition other than, financially, like I was making, 30% of what I made at my law firm in my first job out. So like that is a shift. And I'm so glad I made it before I had dependents, or I don't know. I just like processed that like that's what I would have to do. So that was very useful before I had golden handcuffs or whatever else. My parents are amazing. My parents, Noorain and Shaukat Khan, are like just iconic. My father has always, my father's a physician. My mom was a middle school teacher and then became a stay-at-home parent, very active parent, working mom at home. And nothing, I think that probably the financial remuneration probably gave them pause. But other than that, they're like, go be happy, go flourish, live out your values. And I have to like take a moment because, I was a woman. Like, I don't know. I'll have to go back and ask if I was a man, like if they would have thought differently about that. But they were just like, go be happy. This is not making you happy, and your attention is required elsewhere. Yeah, my dad is a Renaissance man, and my mom is incredibly supportive, and she wants me to be happy. So I don't know how that came about, but they were encouraging.
So we could have a podcast for another 5 hours on this, and I do want to unpack this with you one day. But both you and Amreen, and I've struggled with this as well, which is to say, okay, to overcome the temptation to be in the corporate world and to say, hey, we're going to go and make an impact. We've made these decisions very lightly, but there's so much, it takes a certain kind of person to be able to say, no, I'm going to do this. And there's the psychology.
And I just want to say also that it's like the bravery, right? Again, that word comes to me because to take 30% of your pay, like a 70% pay cut, I don't think a lot of people could trust themselves to, they would be like, what am I doing? This is clearly the wrong choice. And to know that you should just follow that, that's really incredible. I think that you were able to do that.
Well, I don't think I could do it now. Like, I think it's about where you are in life too. Like, I lived in a 6th floor walk up that was like 300 square feet. Like, even when I was like a big law firm lawyer. So like, it really, like, alhamdulillah, like I feel so grateful that I was making choices that permitted that. But like, I think it's also about phase of life and a lot of other circumstances that are beyond like me being bold.
Yeah.
I would not be that bold today at all.
You must have had such good like thigh muscles from that 6th floor walk up.
I'm Breen, like, I don't want to brag that I was in the best shape of my life then.
I can only imagine like the guns from like carrying your grocery bags up 6 floors. Okay, well, I really want to get to this last question, if that's okay. I want to look forward and I want to ask you about your kids and kind of how you think about the world that you're creating for them, because clearly you're motivated by impact and by making a difference and making the world a richer place. And, I started off this interview kind of wanting to ask you how you got back to Girl Scouts when you became an adult, but actually it sounds like you never left. It sounds like you were just always been in Girl Scouts and that organization has been so formative for you.
Yeah.
So, as you look ahead to, the future for your own kids, like what parts of that are you hoping, that they will also like carry with them? And what things, I guess, are you hoping will be different than, where we are now?
It's so I've tried. One of the reasons, like, I go for the things I want to go for and I want to live out my potential is I don't want to live out my potential through my kids. So like, on one hand, I have a vision, like I want them to be whole, happy. I want them to have healthy relationships. I want them to be able to financially support themselves. But I don't have a vision for them. Like, I really want them to be their own people. And in ways that like maybe I'm not comfortable with, like maybe I don't know, maybe it would be unfamiliar to me. But I want to try to be the kind of parent that can be open and permit their flourishing. But like, my job now is to give them tools, like whether it's faith, whether it's skill sets, whether it's relationships and modeling healthy behavior and relationships. So like, I do want to gift them a world that is more hopeful. I want to give them that confidence that my parents gave me about being so proud of who you are. And I've added many more layers for them of like what that looks like. It's, many more cultures, languages, exposure, whatever else. But I think the stuff I care most about is just equipping them to be healthy and engaged and care about the world. And then like gifting them a better world to whatever extent I can. So I'm being like, I don't know. I've definitely had I definitely have thought so much about this. And that's why I'm just like, I don't want to give them a box. And I want them to find their own, what they need. And I hope I'm a part of their life when they grow up. I'm just trying to be like a very forward-thinking parent and also have my own life too, so that I can have things going on and my own stuff, so that they can have their own stuff, if that makes sense.
Oh, that totally makes sense to me. I think I'm the same way. I think I watched my mom after like me and my siblings move out feel a little bit lost because she had put so much into just caring for us for so long. And I think she wasn't really sure what she was supposed to do next.
Yeah.
And I've always thought, like, I'm always, I made a commitment to myself that I'm going to be my own person, regardless of where motherhood takes me. And I'm going to retain that for afterwards, so that, my kids have a sense that I'm here. But I love how you said it. Like, I hope I'm a part of their lives. Like, I think the same way. I'm like, I'm going to try to have no expectations about this. Like, I hope you call. I hope you visit. But I don't know where I'll be.
And I don't expect that you'll care for me. Like, I think I have to I literally have to think through everything that has been communicated to me about not just my responsibilities, but like community and otherwise, like what you're supposed to do for your elders. Like, some form of liberation means choosing some of that. And, if you don't want to, I've got to have a backup plan.
I'm just blown away by one sentence that Noorain said, which is, I don't want to live my potential through my kids. And that just struck me so deeply. Because a lot of the identity questions that I've been grappling on behalf of my daughter. And to realize like they're not my questions to answer for her. I can barely answer them for myself. So I'm like, those, and just coming to a point where we're saying it's okay to, let them, enable them to answer those own questions and then answer them for yourself. It's just a beautiful thought. And it takes a lot of journey to get to where you are. And it might feel like you're already there. So you can't, see how far you've come just being in that position.
Well, Bilal, it's a lot of time.
I think that's so well put, Bilal. And I feel that right now, especially like with the war in Israel and Gaza, I feel like moments like that, I really kind of feel the Muslim part of me kind of feeling like a minority or an outcast a little bit as an American, because I feel the divide, right? And I do feel that responsibility too sometimes to protect my children from that feeling. Like I want them to feel 100% American, and back to that Americana piece. I want them to own the place that they were born and raised in. And I worry about the parts of their identity, like their names that make them stand out and be different. And I feel responsibility over that. But I love that lesson that you just extracted, which is, this is for them to figure out. And like, they will. Like, you have to trust that they're strong enough to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And they're not inheriting the world in which we grew up. Like, it's going to be different. And, I just think about the notion of being a global citizen and so many of our issues not being bound by borders, whether it's, whether it's climate or whatever else, they transcend borders. So they're going to be working with people on things that affect humanity collectively. So it's like, what can we give them? What can we get, like a human rights framework? Like, what can we give them? What tools, what mindsets, whatever else can we give them? But it's all about execution. So I have all this big talk now, and I've got a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. Let's see how.
We'll have you back when they're a little bit older. We'll check.
Yeah. We'll do an accountability check.
Well, thank you, Noorain. We could speak for another 5 hours. There's so many more questions that I have. It's such a joy, and it's, coming full circle on this podcast when Reed was like, Girl Scouts, Americana, and then, you don't expect a Pakistani American there. It's just so full circle to see that. And I remember when I was chatting with Reed earlier, in her podcast that we did together, she was like, I feel American, but I feel others don't feel I'm American.
Yeah.
And what you're able to do and what your journey tells us is you're redefining what it means to be American for other Americans. And that's what makes you so special and extraordinary for our community. And for you, it just might feel like, hey, I'm just living life. But that's where it's special and different. So thank you for being you.
Oh, Bilal, I have to tell you both, like, I have to gush just for a second, like, what a tremendous privilege to talk about the range of things we talked about together. I'm so grateful you guys are doing this. I learned a lot about myself just thinking and reflecting with you. You guys have been so gracious. Like, this is, you call it a joy. I call it a joy too. Like, thank you. Thank you so much for this chance.
This is so fun. I hope that it's fun for listeners too. I just think like we deserve to have these conversations as a community, right? It does feel good to have these conversations and to connect on this. So thank you too for being here for that.